welcome you watching this Friday edition of Global Lens on News 9 Live with me, Neha Khanna. As always, we have a packed schedule for you, and our big focus on the show today is on 2 years of the Russia-Ukraine war. The 24th of February marks exactly 2 years since Russia invaded Ukraine. 2 years on, who is winning this war? As Russia's war in Ukraine enters its third year, the apparent impasse on the battlefield masks decisive shifts. The war's main front is now political, with Russian President Vladimir Putin betting that divisions and hesitations in the West will hand him the victory that he has failed to achieve on the ground. Worried about the consequences for their continent's security if Washington disengages and Ukraine falls, European governments have increased aid to Kyiv in recent months. Collectively, they have now supplied or pledged more weapons to Kyiv than Washington, and more than double the assistance if economic aid is included. That marks a significant shift from the war's early days, but it hasn't been enough to turn the tide for Ukraine. The question on everyone's mind is this: when and how will this war end? The Kremlin has made it abundantly clear that the only negotiated end it will accept is Ukraine's surrender, while the Ukrainians have made it equally clear that they will continue to resist being subsumed into the Russian empire. 2 years on, peace in Europe is still nowhere in sight. Let's now take a look at what some leading global geopolitical analysts have said about the ongoing war and where it may be headed. Angela Stent, author of the book titled Putin's World, Russia Against the West and the Rest, says, as Russia's war in Ukraine enters its third year, the current dynamic stalemate looks set to continue. Neither side is winning or losing. The Russians are making incremental territorial gains at the cost of enormous casualties and lost equipment. The Ukrainians, having failed to achieve the objectives of their 2023 counteroffensive, are on the defensive and also experiencing significant casualties. This war of attrition is taking its toll on Ukraine, where President Volodymyr Zelensky recently parted ways with his top military commander, General Valery Zaluzhny, after fissures between the two became public. Both countries need to mobilize more troops, but there will be no Russian mobilization before Russian President Vladimir Putin's sham re-election next month. For Ukraine, whose population is less than a third the size of Russia's, it will be more difficult to mobilize the forces it needs. Stent goes on to say the war is not only about troops but also about the continued supply of weapons. Russia is purchasing drones from Iran and increasing amounts of artillery ammunition and some missiles from North Korea. Ukraine is dependent on weapon supplies and financial support from Europe and the United States. The European Union's recent approval of 54 billion euros in financial assistance will enable the Ukrainian state to continue functioning, and European NATO members will supply some additional weapons, but the United States remains key. It's the most important supplier of advanced weaponry, and its dysfunctional domestic politics may jeopardize Ukraine's ability to continue to fight Russia. If Congress does not approve the requested $60 billion in assistance to Ukraine, and if the US government does not speed up the supply of advanced weapons, then the outlook for Ukraine's ability to push back against Russia in 2024 is much bleaker. Angela Stent also argues that there is little prospect of negotiations to end the war in 2024, nor can either side achieve a decisive victory. The Kremlin has made clear that it has no interest in negotiations that do not lead to Ukraine's surrender, including the permanent loss of the 4 territories illegally annexed by Russia in 2022. The stated Russian goal remains the so-called denazification, Russian lingo for regime change and demilitarization of Ukraine. No Ukrainian leader would ever agree to such terms. Putin is awaiting the result of this year's US election and hoping that the next US president will withdraw support to Ukraine. In that case, Ukraine's ability to survive as an independent sovereign state would be in question, with all the knock-on effects on the security of Europe and beyond. Proposals for how the war might end, including the Korean model, which would involve an armistice, no peace treaty and Western security guarantees for Ukraine, presuppose that Russia would ever accept an independent Ukraine. As long as Putin or a successor who shares his worldview is in power, that's unlikely to happen. Jo Inge Beckevold, a senior China fellow at the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies, has an interesting perspective. He says when Russian troops crossed into Ukraine in February 2022, it was immediately clear that the invasion would accelerate the geopolitical divide between the United States and its allies on one side and the emerging Sino-Russian axis on the other. In 2024, we're now significantly closer to a bipolar global divide, reminiscent of the Cold War, than was the case just 2 years ago. Beckelvold goes on to say, during the US-Soviet Cold War, Washington was able to exploit the differences between Beijing and Moscow, whereas today Beijing and Moscow are in a stronger position to exploit the differences within the Western Bloc. Now here's what Kristi Raik, Deputy Director of the Estonia-based International Center for Defense and Security, has said. She writes, if Georgia in 2008 and Crimea in 2014 were wake-up calls reminding the West about Russia's aggressive great power ambitions, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 was an electric shock for Europe's continuously decaying defense. If that wasn't enough, presumptive Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump has now openly invited Russia to attack European NATO members. Now that Ukraine is entering the third year of a massive land-sea-air information war, there is a real threat that Russia will gain the upper hand on the battlefield. Already, US military aid to Ukraine has dwindled to a trickle, and the prospect of Trump's election victory in November means that European leaders face the gravest challenge to their continent in generations. If Europe fails this test, Moscow would be emboldened to go further in restoring its sphere of influence and undermining its main enemy, which it has clearly said is NATO. And finally, C. Rajamohan, visiting professor at National University of Singapore, writes, 2024 will test the capacity of all sides to preserve internal coherence amid the war's rapidly rising costs. While its authoritarian system might help Russia suppress its own domestic divisions, it is hard to believe that the massive economic and human costs of Putin's war of choice will have no political impact. For now, though, the question is whether the West can prevent the multiple fault lines in Ukraine's policy from becoming a split. On the face of it, the West's massive economic superiority over Russia would readily allow Ukraine to prevail in a prolonged war with Moscow. The West has been slow in responding to this imperative, and 2024 can tell us if the West can devise a strategy for assisting in supplying Kyiv to hold the current line of contact with Russian forces in the short term and prevail over Putin in a war that will likely last longer than many had expected when it began. All right, let's try and get a perspective from our panel of experts. Joining me on Global Lens tonight is Fred Dwyer, senior journalist and Russia expert, joining us live from Moscow. Ambassador Suresh K. Goel, former Indian diplomat. Professor Sanjay Kumar Pandey, chairperson at the Center for Russian and Central Asian Studies at the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and Major General Sanjay Meston, defense and geopolitical expert. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for waiting patiently. Fred Dwyer, if I could begin with you, welcome to Global Lens. My question to you simply is this. 2 years into the war, where do Russia, Ukraine and the Western Bloc really stand, in your view?
I think it's been a very dynamic time geopolitically, as you summarized there. There is a split that's deepening and widening in the world. It's economic, it's political, and the shaping of countries into not exactly Cold War style blocks, but different sides is proceeding very rapidly. It's happening in the spheres of trade and in political relations and groupings like BRICS and so on. There is definitely a geopolitical divide shaping up before our eyes, and that wasn't that clear even 2 years ago. As far as Russia's concerned, I think they've gone through a lot in the past 2 years. There were ups and downs, especially in 2022, but there were things like the Prigozhin revolt last year, which suggested weakness and division within Russia and Russian society, Russian army. And I think those have ended. What I sense here is a consolidation, not necessarily a very enthusiastic one. I don't know many Russians who are very happy about the war or eager to get on with it. But there's a grim determination, a sort of we're in it, so let's win it. kind of feeling that even average people seem to have. It's grim, but I don't think it's going to change. And of course, the battlefield news, it seems to be that, and certainly I'm taking this from Russian military experts that I talk to, security people, but they believe that the Ukrainian front lines are cracking, that there's a general collapse coming on the Ukrainian side. They're quite optimistic about this spring offensive that they may launch. Nobody will talk about it, but Russia seems to be preparing for a major offensive in the spring, once the ground dries after the mud season, that is. And I think they will be looking to win the war, to win it this year.
They're looking to win the war this year, but can they? You know, we all remember President Putin's famous words that according to him, this quote-unquote special military operation was going to last all of 15 days. And here we are, marking the second anniversary of the war that now enters its third year. Professor Sanjay Kumar Pandey, if I could come to you now. You know, there are some analysts who say that Putin, who of course, as we know, is set to win the sham election that's going to take place in Russia next month, and he will be back as president for another 6-year term. Now, he seems to be betting on the divisions in the Western Bloc and the hesitation that seems to have crept in Western countries to continue providing support to Kyiv. There are those who believe that Putin believes it is these divisions that will hand him the victory that he may have otherwise failed to achieve on the battlefield. How do you think this war is currently poised? There are just so many layers to this, from, what's happened on the battlefield to the continuing financial and military support from the Western Bloc, and of course the fact that it has proven to be a polarizing issue, and we all know where the Republicans, especially Trump, who may very well return as President of the United States later this year, stand on this entire issue.
So you are very right in saying that Putin is banking on Trump's return. Putin is banking on the divisions within the Western Bloc, especially between Europe and US. Putin is also banking on what seems to be a fatigue setting in Ukraine, with an increasing number of Ukrainians now coming to believe that the war is not winnable in the near future, and perhaps peace at any cost is desirable instead of war. So there is also a question mark, as you very rightly said, on US support for the war, especially the billions that Ukrainians are expecting from Europe is now held up. We really don't know how and when the Congress is going to approve it. And what happens after the election is anybody's guess. While I agree with your description of, largely agree with your description of sham elections in Russia, but that does not mean that Putin's popularity is any less than what it was at the start of the war, or that people are not generally supportive of what they see as a war, as a defensive war. They believe that if Russia had not taken the action, special military operation or whatever, in not very distant future, NATO would have invited and included Ukraine, undermining Russian security in a big way. So the Russian public support for the war and for Putin seems solid as of now.
Well, there is no doubt that, Putin continues to be in a very strong position. If I may also mention the fact that the man who led an aborted coup against him is dead and gone, so is his most high-profile opponent, Navalny, who died under mysterious circumstances just a few days ago. But that apart, let me bring in Ambassador Suresh Goel into the conversation. Ambassador Goel, you know, I've been quoting a lot of geopolitical analysts who've written extensively on the occasion of the second anniversary of their war. And of course, the various perspectives that we get are quite interesting. There are those who seem to think that clearly Russia is on the winning side. There are those who say that with Western support, Ukraine actually continues to be on a strong wicket, given that they have managed to withstand these attacks for 2 long years. And then there are those who say that frankly neither side seems to be winning. There is a stalemate. But here is some food for thought. Angela Stent has written that there is little prospect of this war ending in 2024, nor can either side achieve decisive victory, and here's why. The deeply entrenched positions on both sides. The Kremlin has made it clear that it does not want to negotiate with Ukraine unless Ukraine agrees to completely surrender, and that would mean you know, giving up permanently the 4 territories that have been annexed by Russia. And then of course, you know, the biggest point is that no Ukrainian leader is going to accept that, right? And Putin, she says, is also waiting for the results of the US presidential election. If Trump does come back to power and he decides to withdraw support to Kyiv, then that would be a big blow to Ukraine's very ability to survive as an independent sovereign state. What are your thoughts, sir, on these varying perspectives that we've come across?
Thank you very much, Neha. How much time do I have?
Take all the time you need.
All right. I am going to basically start from the very basics. I've listened to all my friends about what is happening in Ukraine, but there is one thing in the entire geopolitics which has been completely ignored. And that is that both Crimea and Ukraine are part of the same geopolitical situation which left hanging the security structures in Europe, even in 1991, after the Soviet Union broke up and the Cold War, quote unquote, ended, which was expected to bring to end the contest for supremacy in Europe between the Soviet Union and USA. I'm using my words very carefully. I said supremacy in Europe between Soviet Union and the USA. Unfortunately, what happened in 1991 did not resolve the issue of security in Europe. And what we are seeing today is the hangover of the unresolved issues, despite all the Minsk agreements, so many agreements signed and everything. And it has continued because I think the power ambitions of the Western Europe, backed by the USA, to have the overarching supremacy control in that area did not go away. And that was the reason that despite the visit of James Baker at that time to Russia, or whatever was left of Russia at that time, after Gorbachev agreed to the breakup and everything, despite all the understandings reached between Baker and Gorbachev at that time, contests have continued, Belarus continued, Crimea happened, and now Ukraine. Simply because NATO, backed by the USA, in fact, I should say, USA continues to use NATO as an instrument to project its power in Europe. And therefore, when Trump says that unless the NATO member countries can bear the expenditure on their defense, he does not mind, or he will actually encourage Russian Federation to attack the NATO country, it's so much of a bull talk, really. He knows it very well that the Atlantic security depends upon Europe, USA alliance holding together and progressing together, because in the mind of the USA leadership, the security basically is Russia withdrawing into a shell where it cannot threaten the transatlantic security. Now, is that going to happen? or how is it going to end up? You talked about war. I don't think the war, the way it is being fought, they will both tire themselves out. Russia certainly has more resources, more holding power in terms of both the military equipment and the personnel as compared to Ukraine, even after backing by Europe. And therefore, given the time, Russia probably will emerge as the winner in the war. But winning the war does not necessarily mean that Russia has been able to secure the European security in its favor. Similarly, even if Ukraine wins, even though my imagination does not permit it, but even if Ukraine wins, it does not mean that Europe will be able to achieve the security. The only possible security is to re-examine what NATO means, where NATO goes, what is the relationship between NATO and Russia. Just think of it. If Russia offers to join NATO, think of it. It's not completely outlandish. After all,
okay.
the most important thing is security. And therefore, what I'm going to say is, I'm going to cut myself short here, even though there is so much more to say. The basic point here is, it's a situation which is changing every day. It's a situation where no one is certain how they are going to work on the security of Europe, given the kind of security system. Germany depends upon the Russian gas.
Okay.
France wants Russian gas. Where are the energy supplies going to come from? Not from the USA, unless they're transported in a tanker. Nobody has the kind of extended supply lines for the energy that Europe needs for its own development and growth. Therefore, it's a very confusing, I would say, tendentious situation where the only answer is really when either of the side is worn out and they come to the table to talk about a kind of a permanent security that Europe needs.
Okay, that's quite a comprehensive analysis. It's very interesting what Ambassador Goel is saying. He's saying it's not completely outlandish to think that Russia could actually join the NATO bloc at some point, though of course most would agree that this war began because Putin did not want NATO in its backyard, and there are many who will argue that this is actually America's proxy war that Ukraine has been forced to fight. And frankly, membership of NATO for Ukraine doesn't seem to be happening anytime in the foreseeable future. And, you know, all things considered, one is compelled to ask, can there be any winners in this war? Since Professor Sanjay Pandey has to leave the show in a few minutes, sir, if I could come back to you and ask you this question, I want to quote to you an analyst, a senior China fellow, the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies, Beckervold, who says that, when Russian troops crossed into Ukraine 2 years ago, it was clear that the invasion would accelerate the geopolitical divide between the US and its allies on the one side and the emerging Sino-Russian axis on the other. Now in 2024, we are much closer to a bipolar global divide, which is reminiscent of the Cold War. The difference, however, is that during the US-Soviet Cold War, Washington was able to exploit the differences between Beijing and Moscow, whereas today Beijing and Moscow are in a much stronger position to exploit the differences within the Western Bloc. Do you believe he has a point? Sir, could you unmute yourself? We can't hear you, sir. Can you unmute yourself, please? Yes, go ahead, sir.
I completely agree with the assertion that the world is increasingly becoming bipolar, where Russia and China together represent one pole, and they are joined by many other countries, including Iran, and they all are hell-bent on somehow limiting the US and NATO influence worldwide. This is reminiscent of the Cold War period, but in certain ways, it is even more dangerous than perhaps it was during the Cold War, in the sense that there were many structures at that time which allowed the US and the then Soviet Union to confabulate and to agree on certain basic norms and principles. I'm afraid many of those norms and principles are up in the air, and it's increasingly becoming no holds barred campaign. And what is also clear, initially before 2014, when after the Munich Security Conference of February 2007, where Putin gave a very stringent criticism of US policies, of unilateralism, and trying to impose a unipolar world. Since then, it was believed that perhaps the differences are there, but things will not go beyond a point. And in any case, the ideological divide is not there, and therefore Cold War is not the appropriate description. Now it seems that even the ideological divide is very much there, where China and Russia have a different worldview, and which is very much against the understanding and worldview of the Western countries.
Clearly.
Where Western style democracy and Western style market economy are and should be adopted by all. Whereas countries like China and Russia believe that each country has the sovereign right to adopt the type of polity
that works best for them. And what's significant is that not only do they have a vastly differing worldview, today you have Russia and a very, very strong China mounting a significant challenge directly to the United States and its supremacy. On that note, Professor Sanjay Pandey, thank you so much, sir, for joining me on Global Lens tonight. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I'll request my other guests to stay on with us. Here's an important reminder for our viewers. We are counting down to the big event that News9 is organizing this coming weekend. The News9 Global Summit is about New India that is recognized as a rising economic power and a major global player. The theme of the summit is how India is poised for the next big leap. What India Thinks Today Summit is being organized by the TV9 Group, and this edition of the summit is unmissable because the keynote address will be delivered by none other than Prime Minister Narendra Modi. What India Thinks Today Summit will be held in New Delhi on the 25th, 26th and 27th of February. Don't forget to tune in.
From Fragile 5 to Top 5, from a laggard to a leader, India under Modi has reimagined the world order. Presenting the second edition of TV9, What India Thinks Today. Summit theme, India poised for the next big leap. Listen to Prime Minister Modi unveil his vision for Viksit Bharat at News9 Global Summit, a TV9 network initiative.
Presented by Poonawalla FinCorp, enabling dreams. Co-powered by Sugar Free, एक छोटा सा चेंज फॉर फिटनेस. बनेगा तो बढ़ेगा इंडिया. अल्ट्राटेक देश का नंबर 1 सीमेंट. नो स्ट्रेस फिनोलेक्स. प्रिया गोल्ड बटर डिलाइट बिस्किट्स कलौंजी के साथ मक्खन का तड़का. स्पेशल पार्टनर प्रभु जी, मिठाई हो या नमकीन, बस मौका चाहिए जी. सर्वोकॉन ट्रांसफॉर्मर एंड स्टेप.
We are trying a lot of experiments, innovations and ideas.
We came out with a new format in audio, which is audio series.
Listening for content-oriented company in India, which is a very unique proposition.
When we look at audio in general, we had music, which is like extremely old format, and then we had podcasts.
A natural extension to Pocket FM is to move from Hindi to regional content. I think I'd love to see their FY24 numbers, which they claim will be close to 1,000 crores. I think there are talks of them to raise another $80 to $100 million of funding.
This and more. Streaming on News9 Plus. News is now content. Subscribe and get free vouchers.
For the very first time in our investigation, we unmasked the killer of Ravindra Matre.
In 5G, we have to stand with the world, and in 6G, we have to lead the world.
Winning a Grammy was an absolutely surreal experience. A defiant performance by Ten Hag's men. Now standing at 7 feet 4 inches, Satnam Singh is making his way into professional wrestling.
We are getting more good news for India.
From fragile 5 to top 5, from a laggard to a leader, India under Modi has reimagined the world order. Presenting the second edition of TV9, What India Thinks Today. Summit theme, India poised for the next big leap. Listen to Prime Minister Modi unveil his vision for Viksit Bharat at News 9 Global Summit, a TV9 network initiative.
Presented by Poonawalla FinCorp, enabling dreams. Co-powered by Sugar Free, एक छोटा सा चेंज फॉर फिटनेस. बनेगा तो बढ़ेगा इंडिया. अल्ट्राटेक देश का नंबर 1 सीमेंट. नो स्ट्रेस फिनोलेक्स. प्रिया गोल्ड बटर डिलाइट बिस्किट्स कलौंजी के साथ मक्खन का तड़का. स्पेशल पार्टनर प्रभु जी, मिठाई हो या नमकीन, बस मौका चाहिए जी. सर्वोकॉन ट्रांसफॉर्मर एंड स्टेबलाइजर, रखे सब कंट्रोल में. सर्वोकॉन.
There's a new video around what deep fake can do.
We have seen a trailer of this a few days back.
Rumors should not be only on the platform.
We'll have to wait and see how those play out.
Hindenburg's report cannot be taken as gospel of truth.
Welcome back. You're watching Global Lens on News 9 Live with me, Neha Khanna, and we're discussing 2 years of the Russia-Ukraine war. Let me go straight across to Major General Sanjay Meston, defense and geopolitical expert. Sir, thank you so much for waiting patiently. My question to you simply is, 2 years down the road, how do you think this war is poised? And do you see it ending anytime in 2024? And do you see any clear winner emerging from this conflict, which President Putin had said would last all of 15 days?
Neha, thank you. I've heard all the discussions, and I'll give you certain viewpoints, including the question you have raised. I think during the discussion it has emerged, that it is again erstwhile Cold War era. However, now China has also come into the folds, Iran has come into the folds of Russia, and the West bloc continues. Now, it is emerging that it is a bipolar world. I would say something else. I think now it is multipolar world. Reason being, today countries like India, and the moment this thing finished, you said India, the emerging, leading power of the world. The global south has today got a lot of significance, and whether it is West, including the United States, or whether it is Russia, China, they have realized the significance of global south. So countries like India, whether now it is African continent, Middle East, and Latin American countries, they have got a very, very emerging important role. Earlier, most of the countries were non-aligned. Non-aligned is not no more. Now these countries have a major role to say. Let's take the Israel-Hamas conflict. Even countries like Egypt, Qatar, UAE, and this latest, prisoner exchange between the Russians and the Ukrainians was, I think, sponsored by UAE. So what it is emerging to that many countries in the global south are now having a voice, and therefore whether it is West or whether it is the Russia, Sino-axis, including Iran, they all have to now today start hearing the voice of the global south. So that is point one. Point two is very, very important, significant issues arise. Who's the winner so far? Is the war heading to victory? First statement is, war is easy to start. This is the biggest lesson, including in Israel-Hamas. No one now knows how to control it and where does it end. It's easy to start a war, and it is a great lesson learned for all the nations, including our country. Starting a war is easy, but no one knows the end state. Putin had predicted in 15 days Ukraine will fall, and he had launched a multi-directional attack. It all fizzled out, and finally now it is 2 years. Now if you see in the geopolitical context, what was the issue? NATO. Threat of NATO. As on date, Finland has already joined. Sweden is almost on the verge of joining. So therefore, two more countries are now part of NATO. What does it imply? The defensive line of the NATO has now extended further towards north. Therefore, there are more problems now for Russia. Point one. Point two is why the world or the West, including America, did not retaliate, did not show any reaction, including Ukraine when Crimea was captured. I would like to highlight today, as an analyst, there are whys. When I was in Afghanistan, I recollect in 2012, Americans had tried a Pakistani post, military post, where 23 frontier force of its soldiers died. Outcome, logistics through entire Pakistan for the ISAF, which was led by America, constituting 49 countries, including Turkey, and most of them were NATO countries. It was blocked. What was the option? Iran, no entry. Therefore, the option was through Russia, and there was something known as the Northern Distribution Network. You will be surprised, President Putin gave NATO a solid transit base to NATO in Russia. The logistics were coming through Baltics, through the Black Sea, Georgia. They were converging to this transit base, and from there they were coming to Central Asian republics into Afghanistan from the northern side. So Russia has talked about the constant NATO threat. The first question is, why did the Russians agree to give a NATO transit point to NATO in their own territory? And I think when the war was happening, many Russians had raked up this issue, and this was just brushed aside. Two, why didn't the West react when Crimea fell? Because since Russians have obliged them, so therefore they turned a blind eye towards Crimea invasion, and that itself set the launch pad for Russia to invade Ukraine 2 years back. So President Putin's aim is very clear. Whatever losses his nation has suffered as the erstwhile USSR, he now wants to take them back gradually into his fold. His influence in Central Asian republics has been there. Okay. We know what has happened in Georgia, etc. So the question is, where does this war lead? I think, as on date, it's a stalemate.
Yes.
No clear winners. Yes, on the battlefront, two countries are now more or less part of NATO, which is against Russia. Russia has made military significant gains, but at what cost? Enormous cost. One of his soldiers who had just tweeted, about 16,000 soldiers just died in just a 6 months war to retake this Avantika, whatever this place was. And he's committed suicide because he knows what will be the outcome. So is it at that cost, such a heavy cost?
It has come at a very heavy cost to Russians, Ukrainians and entire families. There is no doubt about that. And 2 years down the road, there is still no end in sight to this war. I'll come back to you, sir. Let me go back at this point to Fred Wire. Fred Wire, I want your thoughts on two arguments that have been made. One is that what's currently happening is reminiscent of the Cold War era, with one big difference, that back then Washington was in a position to exploit the differences between Beijing and Moscow. Today it is the other way around, that Russia and China are in a much stronger position, and this axis actually is better positioned to sort of leverage the divisions that seem to exist in the Western bloc. That's point number one. Another argument that's being made is that primarily, the direction of this war depends on how much longer the United States is willing to support Ukraine. If the US Congress, for example, does not approve the requested $60 billion in assistance, and if the US government does not speed up the supply of advanced weapons, then it will become increasingly difficult, if not impossible, for Ukraine to push back against Russia in 2024. What are your thoughts?
Well, to take your second question first, I think there's a very American-centric view that sees that imagines that Trump is going to come and end the war, and that American aid is fundamental to Ukrainian survival. This is what the American discourse is all about. I live in Russia, and I talk to Russians and Russian security experts, political experts and figures, and they are not waiting for Trump to come back. They already saw what happens under 4 years of Donald Trump. It was chaos. There was absolutely no progress in U.S.-Russian relations with Trump, because he may have these thoughts about improving relations and getting along with Putin and so on, but he had no way to follow through with them. And when Putin said the other day that he would prefer Biden, I think he was just being sincere. I think he absolutely would prefer Biden. And as for American aid, yes, it's incredibly important. It's humongous amounts of money and materiel that the Americans did provide to Ukraine. I think that it's running dry, not just because there's political divisions in the United States, but because they're actually physically running out of stuff to send. And again, taking my cue from Russian security experts, yes, they really hate it that the Americans supply all this stuff to the Ukrainians. They figure the war would have been over much faster if there hadn't been all that Western support. But they also sound pretty confident, and I don't know, I'm not a military guy, I'm not even a Russian, but I listen to them, and they sound pretty confident that they are going to win this war, no matter how much aid the United States and NATO shovel into Ukraine. So that's I think the Russians have this determination, and it has settled in. If they started the war with some idea of regime change in Kyiv and that it would be over in 15 days and so on, they've certainly got over that. They've reconstituted the old Soviet military-industrial complex. They're now churning out vast amounts of arms and ammunition and other materiel. It's amazing, even what you can learn from public sources, the extent to which the Russian military economy has ramped up, and they're clearly in it for the long haul. As for the geopolitical divide, yes, I think that the big difference now, you can tell by looking at my face that I grew up in the old Cold War, knew it very well, crossed that wall in Berlin several times, and there were two different universes, really, and they were divided mainly by ideology. There were two different blueprints for how people should live, and if you went from West to East Berlin and back, you really could see those two completely different worlds, each the result of a different ideological blueprint. That's not the case anymore. I live in Moscow, and all the services, the market economy services, from hamburgers to the Chinese delivery to taxis and all the things that weren't in the Soviet Union. And I know I lived in the Soviet Union for 5 years myself. This is a capitalist country, a market economy, which is maybe state-led or dirigist, as they say, but it's not. There's not an ideological divide anymore. This divide is geopolitical. It's between power blocks, and this is what things. I'm more hopeful that a solution can be found that doesn't require one to exterminate, or I don't mean exterminate, I mean annihilate the other, which is what happened in the first Cold War. One absolutely won, and the other disappeared from the face of the earth. I mean, in terms of ideological presence. In this case, I think they can come to an agreement that we don't have to see this massively divided world that we had before. And if we do, it's no longer, to my mind, inevitable that the West will win.
Okay. You know, it's certainly good to see your optimism because you believe that the two sides can come to an agreement. Earlier, you even said that you're hopeful that perhaps this war could end before the end of 2022. But I'm not sure how many would share your optimism on that. Ambassador Goel, your thoughts? Of course, Redwire makes some very interesting points. He says not apt to compare this to the Cold War era. This divide is not even ideological. This is geopolitical. This is all about power blocks. I don't think we can disagree with that. And then he says, you know, all those who say that Ukraine's victory or otherwise entirely depends on American aid and support are overstating the case. Would you agree with that?
Neha, I think basically what has happened is completely, what you're saying is absolutely right. The issue is not really the war or who is going to win the war. I think the issue really here is who is going to emerge as the power broker in the area. Who will be commanding the power in the area? Who will be the most important power really? Ukraine has become a pawn. I'm sorry to use that word. Ukraine is a sovereign country and I hate to use the word, but the fact is that for whatever reasons, Ukraine decided to fight Europe's war, and they're fighting Europe's war. The issue really here is whether eventually there will be a security arrangement in Europe where both Russia and the USA and Europe feel equally confident in the structure. Till that happens, whether it is Ukraine or Crimea or whatever, is going to continue. Maybe the war will end, but the security will not arrive. And that is where I will end my comment.
All right, appreciate that. Major General Sanjay Meston, sir, we're running out of time. Very quickly, if you could wrap up this discussion for us, where do you see this war going from here on? Do you see any possibility of the two sides coming to some sort of an understanding and ending the war before the end of 2024? Of course, everyone's very closely watching the US presidential election too.
Yeah, Neha, all options are possible. War may even end tomorrow, or it may last more than 1 year, it may last 10 years, it may last 5 years. Very difficult to predict. Anything is possible, especially in the geopolitical realm. Some leader dying, some leader being assassinated, some regime change happens. Overnight, some things can happen. There is a change in the army way of functioning. There is a revolt within the army. Any option and possibility is open. So I would really say very difficult to sum up. Situation is very, very complex. However, the war between the West and Russia will continue, and the battleground continues to be Ukraine, and Ukraine is suffering the consequences. However, I also personally feel, and I agree with both the previous panelists, that whether President Trump comes or anyone comes, West support, including America, will support, because tomorrow if they don't support, America stops supporting, its credibility with all countries will diminish. No one will trust Americans.
So American support to Kiev will continue regardless of whether a Democrat is in the White House or a Republican, but there is also agreement on our panel that this is really America's proxy war, with Ukraine having become a pawn in this power play. Well, on that note, Fred Wire, Ambassador Suresh Goel, Major General Sanjay Meston and Professor Sanjay Pandey, thank you to all of you for joining me on Global Lens tonight. And talking about the United States and Russia, another important story has developed over the last few days, and this is with regard to Navalny, the Russian opposition leader who died just a few days ago. President Joe Biden had a private and emotional meeting with the widow and daughter of Alexei Navalny in California on Thursday as his administration announced fresh sanctions against Russia over the death of the Kremlin opposition leader. The visit at a hotel in San Francisco came as the White House backed Navalny's mother in her fight to retrieve her son's body, which Russian authorities have refused to release even days after he died in an Arctic prison. Navalny's team says the 47-year-old, President Putin's most outspoken critic, was murdered. Today, Biden marked the 2-year anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine by blasting Putin's vicious onslaught, as he put it, and announcing a new tranche of sanctions for the death of Navalny and for America's continued military campaign.
This morning I had the honor of meeting with Alexei Navalny's wife and daughter. As to state the obvious, he was a man of incredible courage. And it's amazing how his wife and daughter are emulating that. And we're going to be announcing the sanctions against Putin, who is responsible for his death, tomorrow. And but one thing that was made clear to me is that Yolanda is she's going to continue the fight we have underway. So we're not letting up.
The United States will be slapping sanctions on more than 500 targets linked to Moscow in action marking 2 years since Russia began its invasion of Ukraine, the number 2 Treasury official told Reuters on Thursday. It's part of a coordinated Western effort to pile pressure on the Kremlin, with Britain also announcing new sanctions on Thursday and the European Union the day before. In an interview with Reuters, Deputy U.S. Treasury Secretary Wally Adeyemo explained what the sanctions, coming on Friday, aim to do.
Making sure that Russia can't get access to the goods they need to build the weapons that they want, and also taking responsibility for slowing down Russia's access to the revenues they need to prop up their economy, but also to build the weapons that they want going forward. These sanctions will be targeted at the military-industrialized complex in Russia, but also in third countries, those companies that help facilitate Russia's access to the goods that they want.
U.S. President Joe Biden had earlier said major new sanctions were coming in response to the Ukraine invasion, as well as the death of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny, though Moscow has denied responsibility for what happened to him. Biden met with Navalny's widow Yulia Navalnaya and their daughter on Thursday. The White House said Biden expressed his admiration for Navalny's extraordinary courage and his legacy of fighting against corruption and for free and democratic Russia. Meanwhile, the fresh penalties Britain announced take aim at 50 individuals and entities linked to the Russian weapons industry and sources of revenue in the metals, diamonds, and energy industries. Among them are 3 electronics companies in China. The Chinese embassy in London responded with a statement saying, quote, "Any action that undermines China's interests will be resolutely countered by the Chinese side." The new rounds of sanctions add to the thousands already targeting Moscow after it began its invasion of Ukraine on February the 24th, 2022, which has so far left tens of thousands of people dead and reduced cities to rubble. Although Russia's economy has performed above expectations in the past 2 years, IMF spokesperson Julie Kozak said on Thursday it was, quote, "clear that Russia is now in a war economy." She pointed to its reliance on military spending to boost weapons production and government subsidies to prop up consumption, while inflation is rising in the country.
And as we wrap up this Friday edition of Global Lens here on News9 Live, let's remind you we are counting down to the mega event that News9 is organizing this weekend. The News9 Global Summit is about the new India that's recognized as a rising economic power and a major global player. The theme of the summit is how India is poised for the next big leap. What India Thinks Today Summit is being organized by the TV9 Group, and this edition of the summit is unmissable because the keynote address will be delivered by Prime Minister Narendra Modi. What India Thinks Today Summit is going to be held on the 25th, 26th and 27th of February. Don't miss it.
Start with the end in mind. You need to know where you want to reach. Every morning that we wake up, we are exercising our choice. The destiny is decided. The results are known that I'm going to win.